Mario, can you record on your end the Spanish session, please?
Yes.
All right, welcome everyone to our final session on the pesticides. The session is going to focus on messaging and training in the context of culture. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. This session is being simultaneously interpreted into Spanish. To switch your audio over to the Spanish channel, locate the globe-shaped icon in the Zoom toolbar. Click on the globe and select Spanish from the menu. Next slide. To match what you're hearing to what you are seeing at the top of your screen, there is a View Options tab. You can click on that tab. A drop-down menu will appear where you can select either English or, excuse me, you can select either the English or Spanish slide decks to view. If you happen to have the most updated version of Zoom, the individual English and Spanish presentations should appear at the top of your screen where you can easily toggle between both. Next slide. This session has been approved for 1 hour or unit of both continuing nursing and medical education. To claim credit, you must attend at least 80% of the session and submit the post-session evaluation, which will be made available at the end of this presentation. Next slide. For accrediting agency compliance, I'm going to go ahead and read aloud the disclosure statement. We have no relevant financial relationships that relate to this presentation, nor do we have any relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. This presentation was supported by an independent medical education grant by the University of Illinois, Chicago. No relevant financial relationships were identified for any individuals with the ability to control content of the activity. Next slide. All right, actually, let's go back to that slide. Sorry, Marty, let's go back one more slide. Presenting today are Amy Liebman, Alma Galvan, and Maggie Acosta. Amy Liebman serves as Chief Program Officer, Workers, Environmental, and Climate. With MCN, she's established a nationally recognized initiatives to improve the health and safety of immigrant workers and families. She oversees programs ranging from integrating occupational and environmental medicine into primary care to designing worker safety interventions. Alma Galvan is the Director of Community Engagement and Worker Training. Bicultural and bilingual, Alma has worked for more than 3 decades to improve the health of communities disadvantaged by structural inequalities in the U.S., Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Latin America. Her work has focused on a broad range of topics in public health, including infectious disease, environmental health, and health justice, and climate, just to name a few. Maggie Acosta is a public health researcher with experience in both rural and urban areas in the United States, India, and Peru. She serves a multi-scholar mixed method approach to better understand structural determinants of health and help strengthen health infrastructure. Her vision for health research is to not only study inequities and power, but to leverage the research process itself to enhance community capacity and build power as a central component in achieving health equity. It's truly a pleasure to have the 3 of you with us. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Amy. She can take it over and go ahead and go to the next slide. Mario, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I think I'm a little bit delayed, so if I'm having issues, Martha, just interrupt me. But hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm just going to start us off. I'm going to go over some objectives, and then I'm going to hand it off to my esteemed colleagues, Alma and Maggie. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to describe some of the challenges farm workers might encounter in protecting themselves from pesticide exposure, talk about appropriate messaging and approaches for working with patients to prevent pesticide exposure at work. And we're going to go ahead and find, look at training materials and messaging tools for patients. Next slide. And maybe for this one, Alma and Maggie will turn our videos off, and then I'll turn my video off when I'm done speaking. So we just wanted to give you a quick overview of some demographics. I think many of you on this webinar already know when we're talking about the farm worker population, we're looking at about an estimated 2.5 million people. And a lot of this information comes from the National Agricultural Worker Survey, which is showing that we have an increasing number of women working in agriculture. Unfortunately, it's a little bit skewed because there's also a lot of H-2A workers that aren't included in this survey. So I think with our standing and seasonal migrant population, we have a lot more women, and then with our H-2A workers, we actually have some more men. The average age, about 25% are under the age of 30, but we're seeing increasingly some older farm workers from this survey data. Next slide, please. Okay, the predominant language of our farm worker population is Spanish. About 70% are born in other countries, largely Mexico, but we're seeing lots of folks from Central America as well. And that also means that we're seeing folks that don't necessarily speak English or Spanish, but may speak an indigenous language. And about half of our workers, or a little less than half of workers right now, are working without authorization. Next slide, please. By and large, our agricultural workers have an average education of about ninth grade, and that's something really important to think about as we're developing messaging and materials. The income level is low, and that many farm worker families live below the federal poverty line. Majority do not have insurance, and many do not use the U.S. health system, have not visited a provider in the U.S. healthcare system in the last 2 years. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just talk to you just a little bit about the worker protection standard to give you some context about the importance of some of the regulatory framework that is behind why Maggie and Elma are going to talk so much about the importance of messaging and education. But basically, the worker protection standard is a regulation, and it's intended to reduce the risk of illness or injury to workers or handlers resulting from occupational exposures to pesticides. Next slide, please. So one thing that's really critical about this and a really important part of any training that's done is that the worker protection standard has an anti-retaliation piece to it. And so workers cannot be fired or punished for attempting to comply with the standard or exercising their rights under the worker protection standard. Next slide, please. So there's basically three pieces to the WPS. Inform, protect, and mitigate. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about ways to inform and culturally contextual ways to inform workers. And I just want to go through these different parts of the WPS quickly so that we can talk about the inform part of it. Next slide. Next slide. So pesticide safety training is required every year for workers. And next slide, please. And this is really important. The content of the trainings must talk about the health effects of pesticides, how to reduce exposures at work and prevent take-home exposures, location on detailed information about the pesticides recently applied, how to follow directions and or signs about keeping out of the pesticide-treated areas. Training must include information about decontamination procedures and what to do in the case of an emergency, and also how to report violations to state enforcement agencies and what their anti-retaliation protections are. Next slide, please. So part of informing is notifying. Next slide, please. And that could be having the sign that was in the previous slide or pesticide safety information, information posted. Next slide, please. and also what to do in case of an emergency. Next slide, please. So another piece of the informing, and this is really important, is that workers may designate another individual to get the information they need about the pesticides used in their work site. So they could ask somebody from rural legal aid to help them out if they don't feel like they're getting the information that they need. If they need to go back to Mexico and they're dealing with a pesticide exposure, they can ask somebody to get the information about the types of pesticides used. And that's a really important worker protection piece. Next slide. Also, clinicians need to have access to information. Next slide. So when an agricultural worker seeks medical care due to a pesticide exposure, employers must make available safety data sheets, which we've talked about in our previous webinar series, the product information or the label, and application information that's pertinent to the medical personnel. Like, was this being sprayed? Was this, how did the incident happen? Next slide, please. So another aspect that we do training on is protection. And so one of the ways that we protect workers is that we fought very hard and we have a minimum age. So if you are 18 years or you're younger than 18 years old, you may not apply pesticides and you may not go into restricted entry intervals. Next slide, please. And members of an individual family are exempt from this requirement. Next slide, please. Restricted entry intervals must be posted. So next slide, that means that there's a certain amount of time that workers cannot enter into areas that have been where a pesticide has been applied. And there's also something called an application exclusion zone. And you're going to hear a lot about that in the trainings and then talk about that. But basically, it's saying that you cannot spray a pesticide where there are people. Next slide, please. And the application exclusion zone has a small area around where the pesticide is applied, where no one is permitted to be. It's 25 to 100-foot area. Next slide, please. And this is just giving an example of some of the that the area of the application exclusion zone moves with the application equipment. So that 25 feet or 100 feet isn't at the start of the application. It moves with the application. The other piece of trying to prevent exposures and mitigating it is PPE or personal protective equipment. And someone who's worked in pesticides for a long time, the only nice thing I can say about COVID is that everyone is familiar with what PPE is. Next slide. So when a chemical requires that a respirator needs to be used, employers must provide handlers with a medical evaluation and fit testing for that particular respirator and training on it. Next slide, please. Next slide. And then, so you have the WPS is about informing, which is include training and posting of signs. It includes the ways to protect workers with like PPE, the application exclusion zone. But then what happens should something happen, should an exposure happen? So that's the mitigation piece. And the first part is decontamination supplies must be made available to workers. Next slide, please. And 1 gallon of water for each worker and 3 gallons of water for each handling and each early entry worker must be available. Next slide, please. Emergency eye wash stations are needed. And then when emergency assistance is another part of the mitigation process. So next slide, please. Employers must provide prompt transportation to an emergency medical facility for workers or pesticide handlers who may have been exposed to a pesticide. And that's part of the WPS, and that's part of what workers are trained on. Next slide. Linda Forrest went over this, but the safety data sheets are required. And so that when a incident happens, the medical personnel treating the patient or the farm worker needs to have access to the safety data sheets. Next slide, please. All right, so that was a really quick overview of the WPS. And I went through it a little bit fast. I can speak for hours on it and all the work that we did to get it to you, get it to workers. But I'm going to hand it over to Alma and Maggie, who are going to talk about the training that we need. Thank you so much, Alma, and I will let you talk about the training piece.
Thank you, Amy. And I will give everyone a minute so you can switch. I'm going to present in Spanish, so you can switch to your slides and your audio to English for those that need it. Y con eso agradezco el que estar aquí y voy a hablar después de lo que Amy ha estado comentando. ¿Cuál es el enfoque que MCM tiene en relación a cómo es que los trabajadores se pueden proteger? De acuerdo a nuestro esquema, los trabajadores necesitan, por supuesto, entrenamiento en su idioma, con el lenguaje que ellos entiendan. Requieren también tener el equipo de protección personal.
Need to have the PPE or personal protective equipment. They also need to know their rights and to know what is it that they can receive and can ask. And of course, it has responsibilities also. And another super important piece are the resources, community resources, as well as those that are dedicated and culturally and linguistically adequate for them. Next, then this means something very important for all the healthcare providers. This could be all the way from the physician to a promoter of health or somebody that is at the entrance of a clinic. What does this mean? And if you have a comment, please write it down on the chat so that we are able to make this a little bit more interactive. Melissa is telling me she does not understand. Melissa.
Do I need? Melissa, what you need to do is go over there to the world symbols where it says interpretation, and you go and choose English. And up there in view options, you also can select the English one. So you can see the presentation in English. Okay, so I hope, Melissa, that you are able to. Okay, well, I will continue, and please, if you need Noel or Marta to make any announcement, let me know, okay? So it is, I think creo que el hecho de que estemos.
I believe the fact that we are here switching from one language to another one is a very important piece about why resources and why training has to happen in the language people understand. And to us in MCN, language access is a very important piece of what we do. Next, please. Then it means for MCN, as well as everybody working with a population whose language is not English, that we need to create educational materials that are culturally right, so that the workers, next slide please, consider
el lenguaje.
Language. Because language is not only to be able to communicate with people, but it is an entry point to the customs, to the traditions, to the values and anti-values, as well as social conditions, environment, and power dynamics that are happening within a community. So it is very important for us to know about this when we develop educational materials or when we carry out a training. Next slide, please. For this purpose, we need to consider what is called literacy. And we have two important aspects in this way. Literacy, which is education having to do with something a person may have, like knowing how to read and write, but also literacy having to do with health. Next slide, please. And then this is a definition of what literacy, health literacy is all about. That is what we are concerned about. This means that somebody needs to have a verbal communication. This is to understand, to have spoken communication, as well as understanding number and math. Another important piece is that they know how to use this information, and also that they know how to read it. This is that they can interpret the writing language that we have here. But also the most important piece, that is the one on the right on red, is that they know how to navigate the health system. So what we call literacy, health literacy, is way more complex than just reading and writing and understanding, but handling the information that we are giving in to protect ourselves and others. And very frequently, we focus on literacy of the person that we're working with. But there is another important matter. Next slide, please. We need to consider also literacy of the organization. This is we as service providers of health of our clinic, our organization, or our hospital. So health literacy and organizational literacy is a degree to which organizations equitatively enable individuals to find, understand, and use information. If we don't provide them with information that is clear, simple, and according to their own language, then we are not obtaining the health literacy of our organization. So we need to be very cautious among us first. We need to actually be literate ourselves to then be able to help others that we will be working with. Next slide, please. And well, we also use a lot popular education. What does this mean? That there's not a single way of presenting the message to people, and we need to be dynamic and connected with the experiences, with the values of people, with their culture, of the people we're working with. This is popular education. It's not just to give an idea, but it is to actually connect with what people know so that people may use it. If we use this kind of education, then we can be an organization which is culturally right. Next slide, please. Okay, so we believe deeply that one of the strategies on public health that we must use is community health promoters. We believe they are such an important piece to personalize education, speak about culture, values, and build networks and coalitions that will be able to help them to do better in health care. Next. And well, summarizing, here we have the strategies that we use. One, the community health promoter. Second, language justice, train people in the language they will train others, and not a different one. Why? Well, that the person has all the details of the language. that she will be actually helping with. This will promote health equity as well as a greater collaboration and community mobilization as another strategy of a scope to communities. Then, based upon all this, we have worked hard on training, education materials development. These are some of the ones you will be able to find in our internet websites. These materials, next slide, have this characteristic that we're saying right now. They connect with the people's reality. Next slide. Those who've seen these comics, that you will be able to see the pictures and the topics and the words connect with what people give a value to. Because we do them with the people and not only for the people, so they are involved. Next slide, please. It also provides practical solutions because our community is concrete, so we need concrete things. And this is what we do with comic books. This is what we are developing. Now, simple and clear. And well, we will be presenting having to do with slides. This material called John, Open Your Eyes, Juan Abre los Ojos. And you can download it, and it has to do with the standard to protect the agricultural worker. I'm not going to stop a lot, but I want you to see how a conversation between tomato growers and the conditions they suffer. Next slide, please. Mario, Marta, if you can just go through it little by little. So the conversation happens in the field, and we approach the matters about how they are exposed to these pesticides and how to stop or avoid them, to be getting home, the family, and the things they love or they're interested in for them, and how the exposition routes can be, and the concrete steps you can take to avoid other people from being exposed. So this is a combination between the standard of protection of the agricultural worker, when at the same time we see complete and concrete solutions on how we can deal with this. So here we have this other material, which is the training on security for agricultural workers that we did together with RISCA, and that also speaks about this standard of the agricultural worker.
Todos estos materiales ustedes los van a poder recibir o lo pueden bajar de nuestro sitio de internet y ustedes los pueden adaptar, eso es lo bueno, o sea, están ahí también las guías, es decir, ideas bien concretas de cómo el promotor de salud o cómo el clínico puede utilizar este entrenamiento paso por paso, slide por slide, diapositiva por diapositiva. Y ustedes van a poder ver que les están poniendo los enlaces para que ustedes puedan entrar y bajar estos materiales. ¿Qué sigue, por favor? Estos materiales todos son...
I want to pause, Martha, the translation is off now.
Okay. So you want me to speak in English?
No, I think we just need to fix that issue.
De acuerdo. Okay. You let me know then.
The translators, are you guys not able to translate? Is that what the problem is?
No, sorry, I had a problem, a technical problem, but I'm back.
Okay, all right. Please continue, Alma, in Spanish.
In Spanish, okay. Entonces, en el sitio de internet, eso es lo que está
in the website, this is what you can see, and you can see each and every one of the material, the old material we had, so you can, in detail, use them. The next one, please. And with all of this said, we want to share some of the practices, more effective practices, and what works for us. And some of this is to recognize the process, and you cannot do this quickly to develop this education material is something that in where you can have to involve the people. You have to take some time to know the language, the value systems, and train the promoters, the health promoters, so that they can work on campaigns that are according to the community. So that's one of the more important things. MCN have been working with this material so we can do campaigns in a simple way and according to the community, and to develop these materials that are culturally appropriate. It takes time, but it's very effective, and you can use them not only in one session, but in many different sessions, in many different ways. It all depends on how you use it. And the other thing that is very important is to take into account the literacy uh, health related in the people, in the community, in the organization, because one material doesn't function for all of it. So we have to use this concept of co-creation of materials. The interpretation or translation of a material is not enough, because within the material or the concept that you can bring over, there isn't always a right translation. So you have to develop material in the language of the people. Another one that is very important is the usage of health promoters as a strategy, a health strategy, a public health strategy. So we recognizing and we try that the health promoter is part of the team, the medical team. They are part of the health team, because it's them who know the community well. And the last two suggestions that we have is to form alliances with community organizations and with the community itself, because it's them that they can tell us how. We might as well have those concepts, but with that, concepts that we obtain from investigation and research, but it's the community who help us to know how to transmit this. And at last, I mentioned the campaigns, hyperlocal campaigns. The next one, please. And with this, I pass it to my colleague, Maria Costa.
Muchas gracias, Alma. Hi, everyone. My name is
Alma.
Maggie Acosta, and I just want to take a second to announce that I'm going to be presenting in English for anyone who wants to double check their audio at this time. So I'm going to be sharing today my lessons learned on working with farm workers to develop educational outreach materials. And here on this slide, you can see a preview of the final product that we came up with together. And I'm going to talk about exactly how we got to this product. Next slide, please. Before we jump in, one more slide, please. Before we jump in, I just want to talk a little bit about my center. So I work at the Great Lakes Center for Farm Worker Health and Well-Being. I'm going to give folks just a second to adjust the slides. One back, please. Thank you. Perfect. Yes, so I work at the Great Lakes Center for Farm Worker Health and Well-Being, and we are one of the 12 NIOSH agricultural health centers. So our center specifically is based in Chicago, Illinois, and we are based out of the UIC School of Public Health. We also have another team of researchers who are in more rural Illinois, and they are at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So our center has various research projects going on, and we also have a team of people who are dedicated entirely to outreach. And our outreach involves collaborating with some of the different nonprofits whose logos you see on this slide. And together we do legal, clinical, and different social service outreach to farm workers all across the state. Next slide, please. And first, I want to give folks an orientation to our approach to outreach to kind of frame why we wanted to work with farm workers to develop educational materials. So I would say that outreach means different things to different people depending on where you're situated. So outreach could look a little different at nonprofits, a little different at legal clinics, and different for academic folks. And usually in an academic context, what outreach means is that there's a team of researchers who have validated information, and they have information that they want to package up nicely and be able to share with a certain group of people whose health would benefit from having that information. And usually what that means is that outreach can look like a one-directional flow of information. It's researchers or academics wanting to share information with a group of people. But at our center, we believe in mutual community engagement, where it should be bi-directional, where our goal is also to learn from farm workers and to leverage their assets so that we have a mutually beneficial relationship. And so what that means for us is that we really strive to have more robust community engagement. And that looks like consulting with farm workers and asking for their input, involving them in our different programs and in the planning stages. More and more, we're collaborating with them in the very early stages as we develop new ideas. And we're hoping that we'll move all the way down towards shared leadership so that there will be a group of farm workers who hopefully soon will be able to have a seat at the table to help us decide what are the things that we want to do in outreach, what are the programs and information that we should be sharing with farm workers. So next slide, please. For that reason, it was really important to us to make sure that all of our outreach materials have farm worker input. And one of the first things that we wanted to focus on was a training on pesticide residue. And this is a distinct training that focuses not on pesticide application, the moment when pesticides are applied to plants, but rather what's left over in the aftermath. So pesticides that remain on the plants and they can travel. So they can travel via wind, water, or they can travel on clothes and shoes. And that's how they can follow farm workers home and contaminate farm workers and other people living in the house. So we really wanted to talk about preventing this kind of poisoning with farm workers. And the first thing that we did was we went to the internet to see what kind of resources already existed out there. And what we found was this resource that is currently on this slide. And you can see that this looks similar to a lot of resources I'm sure many of you have stumbled upon. There are a lot of really promising pieces to this kind of information. You can see one, it's in their language, which is really important. It's in Spanish, which is the main language for a lot of farm workers, not all of them, but it is a main language spoken by farm workers. There's also information that is chunked out into bite-sized pieces, so it's not a lot of text all at once. And there are graphics to accompany the text, so you can imagine what is happening on the scene related to pesticides to have a little bit more context. And even though there are all these promising pieces, there's still barriers that we have to take into account with these kinds of materials. So like both Dr. Liebman and Alma said, Spanish isn't everyone's language. So if Spanish isn't the main language of farm workers, this kind of material is not going to be accessible. We also found that the literacy levels among farm workers varies widely. So when we shared materials that were text heavy, there were some farm workers who couldn't read and couldn't digest the information on the flyers without help from other people. There are also farm workers who have a need for glasses, but they don't have exposable income to be able to buy glasses. So some of the smaller text can be really hard for folks. So for that reason, we came to the conclusion that maybe we wanted to develop our own educational materials and that we should be working with farm workers to make sure that they were accessible. So we wanted to take into account the varying literacy levels, the different languages people could speak, and we wanted to work with farm workers and coming up with something that was visual based. And when we started to look around, we realized that we're probably not the only ones out there who are struggling to find resources that are accessible. There was a study in 2023 that found actually that less than half of the materials that are developed by agricultural organizations and even organizations that are farm worker focused are actually tailored specifically to the needs that farm workers have. So that's the task that we set out to do. Next slide. And this is the process that we through trial and error, really finessed, and now we use in developing our educational materials with farm workers. So first, we have to pick a topic, and that can come from farm workers themselves, from the research team, from the outreach team, or from literature. And from there, we move on to seeing if there's a resource out there that already exists. What lessons can we learn from others who've done this? Do we need to recreate the wheel? And for us, on the topic of pesticide residue, we did think that we needed to come up with our own graphic. And so where we started was this third box, consulted with a topic expert to come up with some of the key points that we really wanted to make sure we could get across. So we didn't focus on, a page worth of text, but really narrowing down the key points and concepts that we wanted to make sure people could understand. So that's all the planning stuff. And then from there, we really get into the graphic work and working with farm workers. So here's where we start drafting a graphic. And what we did was we went to the internet and we pulled photos that we thought could capture some of the key concepts that we wanted to share. And we printed those out and we put those on a poster board. And then we started asking farm workers for their feedback. So we asked them, what do you see in this photo? What do you think's happening? How does it connect to the other photos? And what are the takeaways? And through asking some simple questions like these, we were able to narrow down how much of this content is accessible to farm workers. And if it wasn't accessible, we revised the photos to make them more and more specific. And finally, once we had picked the photos that resonated with farm workers, we worked with the local Latinx artist to turn them into art-based graphics in a style that I'll show you all that really looks like a familiar art style to many Mexican and Central American farm workers. And that final product that we came up with is what we distribute to farm workers and continue to talk through with them in the fields. Next slide, please. So this is exactly what it looked like. I know it's hard to visualize from the previous flow chart, but here are all of the posters that we developed. So on the left side is version 1, and this is what we started with. So we showed the flow of the pesticides all the way from the application to how it gets into farm workers' bodies through ingestion and how it gets into their homes by being tracked through shoes. And when we shared that set of photos, what they told us was that we were changing the color of the pesticides too often from photo to photo, and we had to keep it consistent. And they also said, it's helpful to now know about pesticide residue, but what can we do to prevent it? So we came up with a second version, and you can see now we're keeping all of the pesticides one consistent color. We chose white. And then we came up with a second set of photos that are prevention recommendations. And when we took this to the field, farm workers now said, oh, actually, the white looks like a fungus. Change it to a color where we can tell that it's a toxic chemical. And they suggested orange. And they also said, use check marks by each individual photo so we can tell that those are distinct steps that we're supposed to take. So that's how we came up with this third and final version where we now have all of the pesticides in an orange color so folks can see really clearly how they travel and the toxicity of them. And also all of the prevention steps are broken down. And so when we took this to the field, we were able to have more robust conversations with farm workers, and we were able to learn too, what are the barriers in being able to implement this in your life? And from that, we learned a lot of other helpful things. Like we learned that there were farm workers who previously thought that pesticide poisoning only impacted those who applied pesticides the moment of, but they learned that pesticide residue can impact anyone, including people at the home who don't work at farms. We also learned that farm workers were aware that it's helpful to separate their work clothes from their home clothes, but that they didn't have a space to be able to do that. Not all of them even had a laundry basket at home. Some folks were using trash bags to pack up their laundry and to go get it cleaned. And I'll come back to that last point in a second. Next slide, please. So this is the final product. So all of the photos that they gave us feedback on, we then turned into this postcard that is in a style like what you would see in many murals or in art in Mexico and Central America. And all of these photos have now been vetted by farm workers. And what you'll also notice is that at the end, we added on text. And the text is meant to be complementary and to really drive home the points. But the images have already been vetted to capture that concept. So the images can stand alone for folks who can't read or for folks whose Spanish is not their main language. And so in total, we got feedback from 127 farm workers to make this graphic. And we wanted to do something in addition to providing them with the information. We also wanted to give them resources to make it possible to protect themselves. So what we did was we also bought laundry bags so we could give them to farm workers during the training, and they now had a place to separate their work clothes from their other clothes. Next slide, please. And so this is the backside of the postcard. It has 4 prevention steps. And this final product is now available as a postcard and as a poster that can be downloaded from our website. Next slide, please. So I want to second what Alma said earlier, which is that a lot of these more culturally tailored interventions can be time and resource intensive, but I wholeheartedly agree that there are so many benefits to investing your time into these kinds of interventions and to working directly with workers to come up with solutions. So I would say for our project in particular, we found that working with farm workers really improved their comprehension on this topic. We did a small survey with 33 workers after we started distributing the postcards, and we found that it really enhanced their comprehension of the material. So afterwards, just by spending some time looking at the postcards, most farm workers could now explain what pesticide residue was. They could also recognize that any farm worker can be at risk of poisoning, not just farm workers who apply pesticides. And most could also name at least 2 ways to prevent poisoning. Some people could name all 4. The other thing we found was that we were able to have more robust dialogue with farm workers through this training and to learn more about their actual living and working conditions so that we weren't just giving them information that they couldn't apply in life. We were able to learn what are the barriers and how can we help them circumvent those barriers, like working with them to get laundry bags. And then finally, I would say that it enhanced our outreach overall. So we got really robust engagement in this project, but all across the board, our outreach benefited because we were now able to be seen as a more reliable partner by taking into account farm workers' feedback and taking their knowledge seriously. So we found that farm workers started asking us for more resources like connecting them to legal partners, clinical partners, vaccine clinics, dental care, all sorts of resources, and that they generally had more interest in collaborating with us, not only in outreach, but also in our research projects. So I want to say, even though it is time and resource intensive, the benefits are really amazing. And I would invite folks to think about how, with the capacity you have in your organizations, you can also come up with creative ways to work with workers and to take into account their existing knowledge and their culture as an asset that can really help enhance their health. Next slide, please. And I want to say thank you for sharing your time with us. There's also information about my organization, our socials, and our email are on here if you want to connect with us. And I'm really excited to see what questions folks have. Thank you.
Great. So Martha, Martha, you'll be helping with the questions, but I saw one come in that I wanted to address while we're waiting. Thank you both, Maggie and Alma. But somebody was asking for information about women, pregnant women and women of reproductive age. And Noelle's going to put into the chat a comic book that we did a few years ago regarding women of reproductive age and some steps to help with pesticide exposure. Obviously, it's really hard to be exposed at all anytime during pregnancy, but sometimes we know that women have few choices. Also, someone wanted a list of pesticides that can impact women and their babies during pregnancy. And we're going to put the number for, or the link to the National Pesticide Information Center, and they might be able to help you out with compiling a list like that. That was a technical question there. And then I guess for Maggie and Alma, I did see something come through on the chat about in some of the research that folks have done that they've seen that people prefer videos versus pamphlets and other things. So maybe you can all comment on that research that they've found.
Sure. I'm really excited by this question, so maybe I'll go first. So I want to say, a new project that we have going is we're setting up a WhatsApp page to connect with farm workers. And as part of setting that up, again, we're asking for farm worker input and how they want to get information. And yeah, videos are very popular. They're fans of photos with text. And they're saying that WhatsApp is a very common way to be in touch. So we're finding like maybe social media is where we should be moving to, because also outreach can be very resource intensive. For us in Chicago, some of the closest farms are 2 hours away. And if we're driving 2 hours to one farm, we can only go to a farm so many times. But if we're connected via WhatsApp, we can be in touch more often and we can share resources more frequently. So I think there are digital ways to also be in touch. Photos are popular. Videos are popular too, with the caveat that it's like less than a minute, is what I've heard, because then they might want to move on to something else. But yes, videos are very popular.
I totally agree with Maggie. Thank you. And I can add also that another way of passing information is the radio station, and especially for those underserved communities, we use a lot of the community radio station. And there is a lot here in the United States, especially California and the south of the United States. You have organizations that have programs in indigenous languages. I saw that question too. And that's the needs assessment that Maggie and we were talking about. You need to know where are you getting, or what is the target population of those materials. And if you do develop something in Spanish, and then you want to translate it to Creole or to Hmong or to other language, you need to bring someone from that community that speak that language, and then go through the process of what is the concept that you want to do, and not do a direct translation, but do more like an interpretation and co-create and develop in a specific way of probably using the same picture, but adequating the picture or appropriating the picture with elements that will be according to the culture of that specific group. So yes, and I totally agree about the videos. Videos are very important right now. TikTok, WhatsApp, anything. Any other question?
Thank you, Alma. I'm going to jump in really quick just to go through these last couple of slides. Just a reminder to connect with us by signing up for our mailing list and be the first to access our resources, get updates from the field, and register to our upcoming webinars. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And we'd love for you to leave MCN a review on Great Nonprofits. Let others know how our work has impacted you or your communities, or simply why you love MCN. Just leave us a little 1-2 sentence review, and that would be amazing. Let's go to the next slide. And a reminder, just take a few minutes to submit the evaluation. And a reminder on top of that, if you're seeking continuing education, either nursing or medical, submission of the evaluation is required. While you guys are filling out your evaluation, I'm just gonna let you guys know some things. I'll be sending everybody a follow-up email with links to our archived webinars page. And on this page is where you can download the PDF version of the presentation. You can find links to the recording and to the evaluation. Everything will be provided in English and Spanish. With that, thank you for joining us today. I'm not sure if we have time to answer another question or two that's come in.
No. Sure.
I know I saw a question earlier. Someone was asking for the name of the study that you're talking about, Maggie. So if you could stick that into the chat, that would be great.
Ooh, plot twist. It's not a study, it's just our outreach course. So we just function by making sure to always get feedback through surveys. But it's not an independent research project. It's just our general approach to outreach.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that.
And
All right, so I
Maggie,
do see.
no, I'm
Yes,
sorry,
yes, Alma.
if I can just say that the importance of having community health workers using this kind of materials, and if you download Maggie or ours materials, always, also try to adapt it, and there is nothing that is more important than one-to-one interaction, but sometimes it's not possible because we don't have the funds or the people to do it. So that's when you use this kind of tools, but always, be trained or train people in the language they are going to be training other people. That's very important for us.
Thank you so much, Alma. And thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Maggie, Amy, Alma, for sharing the important information. Thank you to Language Access Austin and their wonderful interpreters, Antonio and Gabriela. And also thanks to the rest of our MCN staff that is on helping out. Everybody have a great rest of your day. And like I said, I'll be sending you guys follow-up email later today. So keep your eyes open on your inbox. Thanks, everyone.
Gracias. Nos vemos.